Hello class, this is Professor Quigley and I am here to help you get through 7.6 user-defined functions. And in this problem, we are going to build an application that allows the user to input a number of miles, and what we're going to do is output the number of laps around an average size high school track that they'll have to take. So if you're a runner like myself and you ever ran on a track and you wanted to go 1 mile, you know that's 4 laps around the high school track because that is a typical average quarter-mile track. So if you wanted to go 2 miles, you would have to go 8 times around the track. So what we're going to do is build an application that does nothing but that, and that's allow the user to pass in miles, and we're going to convert that into number of laps. However, in this application, it gets a little tricky because what we're going to do is create 2 functions. One function is going to hold the actual code of the application, and then we're going to have another function that's going to hold the function that does all the calculating, which is basically the number of miles divided by 0.025. So even though it's not a big function, the takeaway from this is that we're going to learn how to create 2 functions and have one function have a line of code that triggers the other function to start, and what it means to create one, declare a type, and actually have a return value. So fair warning, if you're just watching this video thinking you're just going to quickly get through the challenge activities and you have no clue what a function is, I strongly encourage you to go back to the participation activities and go through those slowly, step through all the flow charts and kind of understand what's going on there. I've also made a video titled Weeks 1 through 7 in Real Life. I encourage you to watch that because in that I actually step through the code and I show you actually how a real application progresses from one line to the next, and how whenever it hits a function, rather than going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it'll jump to wherever that function is, take the next steps, and then whenever it gets done with the function, go right back to that line number it started off on. So if that is a little not making sense, I encourage you to go back and watch those videos. But let's go ahead and get started here. So I'm going to click Start. The first thing that I want you to do is to delete every line of code in here. Because when I first started this myself, I started typing on line 3, and I started typing on line 5, and then I got an error message that said I can't have code outside of the function. So apparently Zybooks doesn't like it when you comment your functions. If this was a real application, that's exactly what you would do. You would comment your functions, but I won't go into that. So let's go ahead and start writing. So the first thing we need to do is create a function, and actually everything you have to do is written right here. You can copy and paste it, but I'm actually going to write it. Function. So this is how we actually tell the computer that what I'm about to write is a function. Just kind of like how you would write an if statement. You would start it with if, or if you're doing a while loop, you'd start it with while, or a for loop, you start it with for. If you're creating a function, you start it with the word function. After we say it's going to be a function, we want to give our function a name. So in here, I'm going to follow along with the example, and I always like to create a function. I always like to name my function something that makes sense. So the name should be meaningful. So just like your variables should have meaningful names, so should your function. So that way if another developer is trying to figure out if they want to use your function or not, they shouldn't have to read through your code to figure out what it does. If we call this function miles to laps, then I should have no doubt what this thing is going to do. It is going to convert miles to laps. Now, I have to have a set of parentheses because a function always has a set of parentheses because there's values that you're passing back and forth. So a perfect example is if I'm building a function that calculates the area of a room, I am going to need 2 values. I'm going to need to know what the length of the room was, and I'm going to need to know what the width of the room was. If you give me the length and the width, I will return back to you the area of that room in square feet. So, in order to set up your function so that way you can declare what it is that you need passed in order for you to do that calculation, you're going to do it just like this. You're going to start with the data type that you want to receive. So that is float, and I'm going to hit space, and then I am going to give it a name so that way I can keep track of which one is which. So a perfect example, if this was called calculate area, I could have a float. Like, I can't just say I need 2 floats. The reason why is because later on in my code, I don't know which one's which. So I might need one float that's called length and another float that's called width. So that way later on my next line of code, I could say area equals length, L-E-N-G-T-H, yep, length times width. Spelled that wrong. I'm a horrible typer when people are watching me. So that way I can say, hey, I need a float. And notice I don't have to come over here and declare what these variables were up here by saying float length and then write my function. It's because it's all being declared right here for me. Now, we're not calculating the area, so let's get back to this problem here. So I don't know if you know that, but if you double click a word, it's a real fast way to kind of select the whole thing. And if there's no spaces, it's a little trick there. So if I double click that, I'm holding control and hit C. I double click here, paste. Same thing, copy, paste. So for the function that we're creating here for 7.6, we only need to create one, and it's going to be called float user miles. And in order to do this calculation of converting miles to laps, all we're going to do is say user laps, and again, I don't have to declare user laps. Oh, I do have to declare it, but you have to do it here. Returns float user laps. Okay, so line 1 is everything that you need to do to create a function, other than the actual code within the function. So you say it's going to be a function. I give it a name, miles to laps. I declare what I need in order to do my calculation. So I'm going to need a float, and I'm going to call it user miles. So that way later on in my code, when I say user laps equals user miles divided by 0.25, it will know that user miles was what they gave to me. And this function is going to return something. What is it going to return? It's going to return a variable that is a float, and that's going to be called user laps. The reason why I have to give it a name here is because when I do my math and I assign the results of this, which is basically what they passed in, divided by 25, I'm going to assign that back to the variable that this function is returning. I know that was a lot to take in. You might have to go back and rewind 30 seconds and listen to it again. But again, if you have any problems understanding this and you want to hop on the phone, we could certainly talk through it. So that's that function. Now I need to create a function called main. And the main function, the reason why this is called main is because that's where most programs start. So if you go back and watch that video I created weeks 1 through 7 in real life, you'll notice that in that real life application, all of that code I've written was in a big function called main. Because main is where the computer starts. So just like we have a function here called miles to laps, we don't want the program to start there. We want the program to start in our main function. Typically main functions return nothing because that's the actual program. So enter 1, 2, 3. Now here I'm actually going to have to declare a float, FL. Oh, I'm telling you, man, I can't spell when people are watching. So float user miles. Actually, you know what? So you understand this? I'm actually going to declare this X because I want you to see that what you pass in and what you declare doesn't have to be the same. So I'm going to say we're going to declare float X, and we're going to say X equals get next input. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say put to output. What is it that we're going to put to output? Well, if this was a previous week, we would just say let's just output what they typed in divided by 0.25 to output. And that would technically give us the right answer, but in week 7 we're learning functions. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to say put miles to laps to output. Now remember, it's not enough just to say I want to put the function to output. Like what good is it to say, hey, I want to take all the code and shove it up there? What the user wants is the result of that function, which is basically that return statement. So this function, when we call it here, it's going to return user laps, which user laps is going to equal user miles, which is what was passed in. So in order to pass the values that that function needs, we're going to do just like we did up top where we put the parentheses, but in here, all we got to do is pass in that variable. I don't have to put float space x because inside here we already declared it. So remember, when you have a function, kind of like a loop, all of these lines that are indented are all self-contained. So if I declare float x here, and then I set it to the value of the next input, and then I pass it in here, it already knows that that x is a float. So that's pretty much it. That's how this application works. So when it starts, it's going to start on line 4. It's going to declare a value called x, which is a float. Then we're going to get the next input from the user. Zybooks will do that for us. It'll pretend like it's the user and give us a random value here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put to output, which means right to the screen, the result of this function, which is miles to laps, and I'm passing in what the user gave us. So over here on our function, we're going to receive that, and we're going to say, okay, I receive it, but whenever I receive it, I'm going to give it a different name. I'm going to call it user miles. So this way I can say user laps now equals user miles divided by 25. It's going to return that right back here to line 8. So that way it'll put whatever it returned to output. So I'm going to go ahead and click check, and boom, that is that. Again, if you're having trouble understanding functions, I'd strongly encourage you to go back to that video that I posted, and it's called Weeks 1 through 7 in Real Life. And if you want to go straight to the part about functions, fast forward to the 16-minute mark, because in there I really show you how the computer steps through each line, and I show you how you can see those values passing in, and you can see it jumping back and forth. But that is 7.6. Let me know if you have any questions, but I look forward to seeing you on the next problem. Take care and good luck.